Hi all, welcome back. So today we're doing the 1920s. Actually, we're doing 1919 right up until the early 1930s. The popular image of the 1920s not difficult, right? Flappers, jazz, The Great Gatsby. The reality is, yes, that's there, but it's somewhat darker. It's in fact a very conservative time in American history, and it's really marked by this inward turn toward nativism and xenophobia, which are both symptom and cause of this cultural shift toward quote unquote normalcy. And in fact, return to normalcy, quote unquote, was the awkward. I got to figure out where to stick my it's in front of this little camera to do the air quotes properly. Anyway, was return to normalcy was the awkward slogan of Thomas Harding's 1920 presidential campaign. Now, there's an astute politician who recognized the temper of a nation where many felt that change had gone too far, too fast, and many felt that the White House, especially during the war, and Congress had already had forgotten that the business of America is business, which is another great slogan, Republican slogan of the decade. That was Calvin Coolidge's. So reclaiming middle American values is what the 20s is about, and it's really symbolized in Prohibition, the Volstead Act, the support of which supported older middle-class Protestant American people, mainly men, from working-class, predominantly Catholic immigrants. The rise of nativism is also embodied in the 1915 rebirth of the white supremacist Ku Klux Klan, which quickly became the largest voluntary organization in America outside of churches, with at least 5 million members. Also symptomatic of the era, which we'll talk about, but less easily characterized, was the anti-evolution movement. Partly a function of the emergent fundamentalist movement, which, as we'll get into, saw the establishment of BIOLA, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, and its authorship of the Fundamentals. These anti-evolutionary sentiment is embedded there. It's also, as historian Matthew Taunton suggests, a reaction to the threat of social Darwinism, of eugenics. We'll look at all of that, plus gender, plus race, plus, and we're going for 2 full hours today, so get ready. And maybe you want to break this up into 2 sittings. That's probably a very good idea. Also recall that 1.25 speed, 1.25 speed helps with delivery. Counterintuitively, it helps with retention, and of course, it gets you through 25% faster. Cheers. Okay, so you know already the inward turn after World War One. And partly this is a realization that a lot of that anti-German propaganda, about Germans being baby killers and whatnot, was just war fever nonsense. And hey, Germany, yes, they started the war, but clearly we were fed a lot of lies. And more so, and this is really important, we got into this war to make the world safe for democracy. And yet, the war ends with a bigger threat to America than the Kaiser ever would have been, namely communism. And it's a global threat, right? It's a new regime in Russia that's openly committed to a global revolution, to the destruction of all nation states, which it does not recognize, and of capitalism. Workers of the world unite. It is not just a slogan. Right? It crosses class boundaries, and in fact, the Comintern, the Communist International, its agenda is to foment revolution in other countries, and it is in America trying to do that, just as it is everywhere. So suddenly there are communist spies everywhere, or at least it seems so. There are, definitely, but it seems like there's a lot more than Americans think there are. But more visible than that, even, is the anarchists who tend to also be communists and sometimes are a bit of both. But they're definitely a big presence in the post-war period. Starting during the late war period. They're running amok. They're throwing bombs, and they're almost all Eastern European immigrants, and they seem to be inspired mostly by Russia's workers' paradise. So this is a real thing happening towards the end of the war and into 1919. And the main group in the U.S. that is doing this, the main anarchist terrorist organization, are the Galleanists. Okay, Luigi Galliani was an Italian anarchist communist, and his followers in the States are sending mail bombs to people like wealthy people like Rockefeller, politicians like the Attorney General, businesses, politicians, judges, anyone who's part of this system. And it's nasty. People, often their targets are missed, but whoever opens the packages that's working for them are having their hands blown off. There's dozens of these bombings. And they are intent on starting a class war. In Chicago, at one point, there's even a mass poisoning at this big banquet of hundreds of leading citizens for the new archbishop, which sounds like something out of a Marvel movie, right? It sounds like Gotham City. In any case, it was arsenic. Nobody died because it was discovered, but everyone ended up in the hospital having their stomachs pumped. Just crazy stuff. The worst probably was the Wall Street bombing, which killed 36 or 38 people and a horse. Now, this is revenge for the deportation of Galliani. And so this is going on at the tail end of the war and into 1919, 1920. So we have not just isolationism, but our first big Red Scare in America. And some alarmingly anti-democratic measures are used to get these commies out of the States. Get these anarchists and these communists back to Europe. And with that, we get what are called the Palmer raids, after Attorney General Palmer. So the famous Palmer raids and these sedition trials that are held to deport people. And they're all under the really, really broad powers that Congress gave itself during the war and now extended into the peacetime because of the apparent threat. And one of those is the Espionage Act, another is the Alien Enemies Act. The authority is here to detain, deport anyone without full citizenship, and also a few that are naturalized citizens, as happens with Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman, pictured here. She's a Lithuanian-born Jewish anarchist. She's a free thinker, believes in free love. She's everything conservative Americans hate. And she is targeted, tried, and ends up deported on the famous Soviet Ark, as it's called, this ship that takes 500 other undesirables and ships them all to Russia. Now, J. Edgar Hoover is the man of the hour at this point because he's launching his FBI career. It's now called the Bureau of Investigation, BOI, and he's launching that by being so good at monitoring and disrupting domestic radicals, including anyone involved in labor strikes. He's all of 24 at this point, not a good person. 5 years later, he'll be running the Bureau, and we'll talk about him later in this lecture. Now, 1919 is also the year of this significant post-war recession, and this is a simple result of the economy having been tailored to war work, war production, heading towards a total war economy. And when that munitions production stops, combined with the fact that all these millions of veterans suddenly come home, you have a post-war recession. It's a big lesson for World War II that all nations of the world will try and avoid in various ways, and we'll look at that later. But so with this post-war recession, you see a rash of strikes by unions who have inflated wartime memberships. The unions do well during the war, and a lot of those are recent immigrants in these unions. What you get too is race riots against Black Americans who were pulled north for war work during World War I, and now they're suddenly idle. Or even worse, they become scab laborers when there are strikes. Okay, and African Americans cannot be in unions, white unions generally, so they're often scab laborers. Now, with that, we see. It's not, this is, every summer has race riots at this time period, but this is the worst year for them. It's called Red Summer 1919 because of the amount of blood that's flowing on the streets. 36 cities saw significant race riots in Red Summer 1919. Never underestimate the power of the Humidex to really derange people. Unless you've lived in the Midwest or the torrid zones, you have no idea how hot it can get. And that's always when tempers flare, and that's when Whitey gets upset, when these strikes happen and they start and they head into the black part of town and burn it to the ground, loot and pillage and whatever, right? Any case, this year also saw recruitment soar in the newly formed iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah, so you get the second version of the Ku Klux Klan, and it reforms right here in Stone Mountain, Georgia, where Buddy has just seen Birth of a Nation. He comes out all inspired, and he's like, "I know what to do. Let's reform the Klan," and he does, and it takes off there. That's beginning right there at Stone Mountain, Georgia, is where they have their first meeting of the second iteration in 1915. Lovely ladies of the Daughters of the Confederacy decide that they will commemorate this later on, and they hire to commemorate this spot. So they hire the Danish sculptor Borglum to go and put the likeness of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, the big heroes of the Confederacy, on this mountain. And he says, ladies, that plan is going to be like a postage stamp in a barn. You better sell some more pies, fundraise for a bigger one. So they do, and you get this amazing bas relief there, this sculpture on that mountain, which remains very controversial, obviously, to this day. In any case, Borglum then goes off to do Mount Rushmore. He's a Great Dane. In any case, the Klan is back, and it's easily the most powerful symbol of the times. The most powerful symbol of the hard right turn that America takes during and after World War I. And a big year here is after the war. By the end of the war, by the end of 1919, they've got about 100,000 members, but they're only getting started. They're on their way to becoming the biggest fraternal organization of their time. Rotary only has 20,000 members in 1925. At that point, historians estimate that the Klan has as many as perhaps 5.5 million. And there's rumors that it includes everybody. President Harding is rumored to be in the Klan. Many politicians are, and they certainly the Klan did include many federal and state politicians. Now, this is not your daddy's KKK, and that is a big thing. This is middle America. This is not regional. It is not in the South. Okay, this is national. This is Cleveland. It's Indianapolis. It's California. It's other points north and west, and it's both urban and suburban and big city, right, as well as backwater south. Okay, so it's everywhere. Okay, not a regional phenomena anymore, and not as violent. Okay, that needs to be said. This is not a group of men. I mean, the number in the millions. Pretty much everyone's uncle is in the Klan. They're not all lynching. Okay, they definitely have certain views. I'm not in the least an apologist for the KKK at all, but we have to understand them. What is the context? What's motivating people to do this? Well, it's a few things. One big one is the Great Migration, which I've already given, where 500,000 African Americans left the South, left Dixie between 1910 and 1920 for war work. With that, the black population of the cities in the North goes up significantly. In Chicago, it doubles. In New York, it goes up by 2/3. And some Midwest cities like Detroit, like Cleveland, see massive increases. Cleveland in those years goes from having 8,000 to 34,000 African Americans. Now, a lot of whites are leaving the South as well, but for blacks, this is different. One, it's scaring white Americans who are okay with equality until there's too many blacks around. That's basically the story of the North. But for African Americans, it's really no crossing over into the Jordan, into the Promised Land, which they hope. And you have that paradox that what draws blacks north is disappearing because of their arrival, or invasion, as the whites see it. And so you'll see, for example, segregated schooling in New York for the first time in memory. You see the African-American ghettos, housing segregation that goes on well into the post-war period. You see that they're also in menial jobs and again, not allowed into the white unions. And in fact, industry employs blacks to weaken the unions. So yeah, there'll be the scabs when there are strikes. And that point alone, adds massively to the tensions during the war. Now, the tinderbox is lit in 1919 by the post-war recession, which I've talked about, where that's coming from, why jobs are uber scarce here now, suddenly. And so really nothing new here. It's black as beast ideology. Is very dominant in the very early century as social Darwinism took hold, and most states now have long had racial purity laws, anti-miscegenation laws, such as this one here from Virginia. Okay, so that goes back a long way, and if anything, it's gotten worse. Probably the nadir of race relations is around the year 1900, the Black as Beast movement. But the 1920s is really special in stands out. Because here now we have this middle American xenophobia that that really mirrors the MAGA politics that of our recent times. And part of that is the analogies are very simple. Building the wall, being the promise of the Republicans, and they do then and now, right? So the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 was exactly that. It's also known as the Immigration Act of 1921, and it sets limits on immigration and a quota system based on national origins, which means race. So what this does is limiting immigration to 3% of the population from each nationality as recorded in the 1910 U.S. Census. This effectively cut off almost all Eastern Europeans, which is the target, and because of the Gallianists and the anarchists and the communists. But the most racist restrictive immigration act in U.S. history is still coming, and that passes in 1924. And this reduces Asian immigration to nil, and it establishes a border patrol, and it drops that 3% of the earlier Immigration Act to 2% for all still accepted nationalities. Okay? Now, the Klan is a really good segue to the next topic here, which is prohibition. In fact, this is one of the things they're pushing for hardest. So think of the Klan at this time as kind of anti-immigrant, also anti-Catholic. They're Protestant, and they return to the return to an earlier America, pre-immigration, and also prohibition. Now, prohibition is genius because it's drink is seen as a Catholic thing. Okay, the Catholics are never against having a drink, and Catholic priests definitely have their hooch. Okay, so Protestant pastors not so much. So think of the Baptist teetotaler. Okay, so this is where the prohibition thing is really an anti-immigrant move in disguise. And the hypocrisy of it, of course, is that every businessman in America can also get their booze during Prohibition. It only makes it more exciting. But in any case, Prohibition is a big success of the KKK, and it's a massive failure for the country, because really the 20s and the 30s, with that we get the heyday of organized crime. This is when organized crime becomes organized, and that's also when the term enters the public lexicon, organized crime, and the term syndicate. And almost all of this has to do with Prohibition. And think about it, suddenly these small regional Irish, Italian, Jewish gangs, they're small potatoes, they're now national and powerful, because what had been a legitimate business making millions for in the liquor industry is now theirs, right? And so huge profits now for organized crime, and also half the country is suddenly criminalized. So yeah, it's pretty remarkably obvious why this was just such a bad idea. And these small-time gangs become national, and they become very, very powerful with the amount of money that they now have and control. Now, the other side to this is that because of the huge profits from it, it also affects the police, because suddenly they have this hugely powerful leverage, how they will or will not pursue prohibition. And being poorly paid, the temptation is greater than ever, and a lot of them end up on the take, or as in Chicago, running the booze trade. Now, the problem is that police forces in North America are run by municipalities, and police work as agencies for the mayor's office, which appoints the chief, which holds their budget. And in the bigger U.S. cities, corrupt cops have a long history of being in collusion with these municipal politicians. We've looked at that with Tammany Hall in New York, right, where they're all in the take, and they're all operating not to prevent crime in poor areas, but to protect the wealthy, right? Now, police corruption and brutality it becomes routine in the 20s and 30s. And in fact, Chicago, which is Gangsterland Central, Central, the police are killing 3 times as many people as the gangsters did. So this is where Al Capone is, John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, where we have the famous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. We've got Machine Gun Kelly here. But yes, the police kill 3 times as many people as gangsters do between 1875 and 1920. To serve and collect is the unofficial motto of the police at this time. In any case, police forces had this problem, and the biggest ones had it the worst. And one of those was the LAPD. Really big force in the nation's biggest city with a violent crime that made Chicago actually look pretty good, and that's something that continues right to this day. New York crime is today is a fraction of LA's. But yeah, here the police vice squad is actually a protection racket, and it collects money from organized crime, and that money goes to city officials from the mayor down. The mayor's brother is actually selling jobs on the LAPD. So the worst point of this is under Chief James Two Gun Davis, who sets up a 50-man gun squad in Los Angeles to go after gangsters. But in fact, what they're doing, and Davis is in from 26 to 31. He's back again from 1933 to 39, so he's in for a long period. Two Gun Davis, he's called. And what he's doing actually is eliminating the competition. He declares war on gangsters actually, and goes to the public with this on the radio with this speech, and he says the gun-toting element are going to learn that murder and gun-toting are most inimical to their interests. I will hold court on gunmen in the Los Angeles streets. I want them brought in dead, not alive, and will reprimand any officer who will show the least mercy. Pretty incredible. And of course, what that means, bringing them in dead, is yeah, you're eliminating the competition or anyone that would rat you out. So yeah. Declares war on gangsters, but in fact the LAPD controlled the underworld, and in fact Davis's police even bombed reformed elements who tried to expose them, his 50-man gun squad. So pretty incredible stuff. He's in tight with Mayor Frank Shaw, who later is recalled for corruption, and that is the first time that ever happens to a mayor in American history. But it might have had less to do with Shaw's, with the revelations of his corruption and connections with Davis as it did with the fact that he said some rude things about people that suffered in the Los Angeles floods that happened that same year he's recalled. But in any case, Canadian-born Mayor Frank Shaw, not a great guy. Davis's Red Squad later his gun squad is called the Red Squad. It gets retooled as the Red Squad in the 1930s, as we have a lot of this is the Great Depression era with it's not just the Jodes, as in Grapes of Wrath, who end up in California. It's a whole thousands and thousands of Mexicans that are coming for work. And now the LAPD are retooling themselves as an anti-immigrant protection agency that's keeping the middle class safe from dangerous Latinos that are flooding into LA, many of whom are in gangs, the young guys called Pachucos. So yeah, and ideally even, literally even, the LAPD is used as border patrol when the state passes a law closing its border to anyone who doesn't have the means to support themselves. So the LAPD is actually doing border patrol, and they are also union and strike busting, okay? And according to them, immigrants, union members, are all communists. So this is really explains too why Angelenos tolerate this, right? Because they're keeping them safe, that thin red line. In fact, that was the name of a radio program, the thin blue line, in the post-war era. The thin blue line was a radio show hosted by the police that we're keeping you safe from those dangerous elements. So this is a real theme in American history right through to the through the 60s, 70s to more recent times. Now, the problem of local control is well understood and had been for a very long time. In fact, that is why the BOI, the FBI, had been created in 1908 by Teddy Roosevelt. But it gets expanded massively in the 1920s under President Coolidge, and this is how J. Edgar Hoover becomes so important. He becomes the head of the BOI, and he's really mandated to make this into a modern federal force of significance. He expands the field offices from 9 to 30, brings in professional training, and goes after these these Prohibition era gangsters. There's a movie called Public Enemies where Christian Bale is one of Hoover's men going after Johnny Depp as John Dillinger. That's all about this, but so maybe you have some sense of that. Now, the thing is that the feds have no jurisdiction over local crimes, right? And most crimes that gangsters commit are local in nature. So they have to be really creative in what they go after. So, for example, they investigate Al Capone not for murder, but as a fugitive federal witness, and also ultimately for taxes. And they use the Mann Act, which is an anti-prostitution law, is another good example to bring down a leading Klansman of the time period. Okay, but yeah, they have to be creative in what they charge these gangsters with. So along with the Board of Investigation, the feds create a Board of Prohibition. And this is a federal force specifically to go after liquor violations. President Hoover sets this up in 1927. Elliot Ness leads it, and its focus is Capone's liquor empire. And they are known as the Untouchables. And there's a classic, speaking of movies, a classic movie from, I think it's 1983, The Untouchables. If you haven't seen it, watch it. But yeah, crazy times, and with some continuity to today that we'll talk about later on in the course. But at the same time, you're thinking, Fenima, what about the Roaring *20s? This is all neggy. Well, yeah, but the '20s is the Roaring '20s, and there's significant increases in the economy after 1919. So with that, post-war recession is temporary. In 1920, the economy does start going gangbusters, and the real GNP is going up 4.2% per year. Today, politicians can promise rising GNP, but you cannot move the needle more than 1%. That's a massive victory, right? 0.5 is a victory. 4.2% per year growth in GNP. Real GNP per capita, 2.7% per year. And so why is this happening? Well, there's a few things going on here that really characterize the 1920s. And one of them, which, by the way, is when consumerism comes to a point that it becomes the most important segment of the U.S. economy, which it remains to this day at about consumer spending being upper 60s into 70%, which is actually a dangerous place to be. We've been in that, as we found out in 2008, when consumers stop spending, the economy tanks, and you have to make credit easy again. So we're stuck in an intractable problem, really. In any case, it begins in the 1920s, this consumer economy, and it's fueled largely by credit. The innovation or the discovery that credit is the way to go to sell more gizmos. Now, manufacturers learned that buy now, pay later sells a lot more, and this really is associated mostly with General Motors president Sloan, Alfred Sloan. He begins GMAC, the lending agency, right? Getting your new Buick on the payment plan. Also, mass production really comes into its own along with credit, as does planned obsolescence. Okay? Now, planned obsolescence is also a Sloan specialty. And here I'm talking about the style changes that make consumers realize they need a new vehicle and make GM very wealthy, or its shareholders. GM famously offered a car for every person purpose. That's part of it. So every year you have several levels of upgrades available. So you start at the bottom end, you've got your Chevrolet, then you've got your Pontiac. You might aspire to the Oldsmobile or even higher to the Buick, and at the top end you've got the Cadillac. Now, eventually all the main three automakers are doing the exact same thing. GM also, though, Sloan also mandated new minor changes every year to every vehicle, every line, and major updates every 2 to 3 years. So major style changes every 2 to 3 years. Now this is a new thing, updating something purely for style rather than say for new tech or new safety features. So it really represents a seismic shift in production. And in some ways, though, it's inevitable. Consumerism necessitated this, and the light bulb manufacturers were the first to discover that in the famous Phoebus cartel. And there's a great documentary online about that, the Phoebus cartel. It was a truism of the light bulb manufacturers that they created very good bulbs, and once they sold everyone their lifetime lasting bulbs, there is nothing left to sell. So they had a cartel get together and illegally set mandated that they all agree to create bulbs that only last 1,000 hours. Okay? So it's essentially the same thing. We get a shift here from the Ford principles of durability toward variety and continual revision. Now this is called Sloanism. It's also called flexible mass production. And it's predicated really on that Freudian principle of human irrationality, the emotional need for change and improvement, excitement and novelty, that's eternal, right? That's embedded, but also status and recognition, and not being left behind. Historian Alan Loeb, and I put him down there for you, he explains that Alfred P. Sloan understood that design really was its own advertising, that style would create demand. And here is Sloan pictured on the cover of Time magazine in 1926, becoming a very important American and making GM into the largest corporation in America and eventually the world. He would also help revolutionize North American manufacturing structures by relying as much as he could on outside suppliers for most parts, because that allows GM then to maintain the flexibility to produce multiple model lines and to reallocate your emphases. And in the Great Depression, that meant reallocation from the top ends down to the Chevrolet. And this is also what's called limited backward integration. It also allows you to close different lines that are not producing without losing your workforce. You're not having to train your own workforce for making these vehicles. Others are taking the loss by laying off employees as you move from one thing to another. So flexibility and limited backward integration is what's called. If you're a business major, you've heard of that. And he also is moving to franchised dealerships and introducing industry financing, as I mentioned, GMAC, to boost sales. As it was too, mass advertising came of age in the 1920s, and that's another reason for the boom in the consumerist boom. And that's because of the advent, that relied on the advent of mass culture, which by most definitions is a triad of three things. That's the commercial radio, which begins in 1920, talking film, 1927, and mass circulation magazines. Now, all three are 1920s innovations, and all three are underwritten massively by advertising. Which, by the way, in the interwar, the biggest consumer of advertising space was the auto industry. The second biggest consumer of advertising space was soap manufacturers. And if you ever wonder what's up with that term soap opera, they're named that because radio drama serials, radio soap operas, were largely sponsored by soap manufacturers. In any case, the point being, 1920s is when Madison Avenue, that famous street in New York where the madmen are creatively crafting the nation's desires, where Madison Avenue comes into its own. And yes, advertisers make the 20s roar. And the role of advertising is key to understanding how mass consumption became the basis of the North American economy. Now, interestingly, until the 20s, effective sales promotion was still a learning process. And Pamela Laird, I put her article there as well for you. She maintains that the auto industry as a whole was late to recognize just what it needed to market, and it tended to market much more of the technical and had long print as opposed to the emotional appeal, like the Jordan ad there, which became this uber influential campaign in 1923. But yeah, you might want to check out any given website of auto advertising. I put one there for you, Vintage Auto Ad Collections. Observe for yourself the shift in approach from the 1910s to the 1930s. It's fun to do a deep dive into these websites sometimes. Either way, and that's another important point I want to make, is that kind of like analogous to how miles of track marked progress in the Gilded Age, miles of roadway and automobiles per capita really marks progress by the 1920s. And America 100% leads the pack here by a miracle mile. Okay? Auto ownership in California in the 1920s, where most families now have 2 cars, is higher than it would be in most European countries until the 1970s and 80s. Now, Ford is left behind, and he's learning that mass production makes mass consumerism an imperative, and he thought that by offering his workers a 5 hour a day wage, they would become his own consumers, and that would satisfy that. But what he doesn't realize is, and what Sloan teaches him, is that creating demand through a style change is really where it's at, right? Creating a perceived need. So yeah, motorization, a really big part of the story of the interwar, which, as had the bicycle, but exponentially more, changes everything. So now we have fast food, we have drive-in movies, we have motels, we have the end of the streetcar. We also have the relocation of business from Main Street, from downtown, to what are called taxpayer strips, these new areas on the edge of every American town as you're coming into the city, or sometimes called gasoline alleys. And we have continual massive federal spending on highways, which will really ramp up in the 1950s. The automobile also brought a relief from the health problems of the urban horse, as we saw, and interestingly, it also boosted agricultural production because Americans were roughly 25% of American farmland had been dedicated to growing hay for feeding horses. So that opens up a whole lot of agricultural potential. But there are also concerns, environmental concerns, with what Edison had said would be the coming wonder. And one was whether oil supplies were sufficient for the annually growing millions of people that are taking to motoring. Early days alcohol was discussed as a renewable alternative to oil, but tax policy and also its higher compression made alcohol kind of a dead letter. But then, as Americans soon learned, the problem of supply ran in the opposite direction, because what we get is this Sunbelt oil boom in California. The California strikes in the 1920s. This creates a glut, actually, that sees the price drop by almost 2/3 and right away, and that initiates a failed attempt in the early days at a federal cap on oil production, if you can believe it, in order to maintain the industry, because there's a glut. So that concern was short-lived. So gasoline rather than alcohol is a winner. But now concern emerged, some at least, over the environmental impact of the what were called the noxious exhalations of vehicles. That's a direct quote from a newspaper at the time. And so people are upset with the stink of the automobile. And these concerns initially are limited to that level, to the nuisance level, rather than the health factor. And in any case, problems of incomplete combustion that produce this thick black smoke and this damaging engine knock, you could solve those quite easily, as was discovered, with the addition of a leaded additive. Okay, and so we get leaded gasoline, ethyl. Okay, and what would become a pattern, something super dangerous, becomes mainstreamed, and any qualms over it are quashed. Okay? There was early alarm over worker deaths involved in the production of this, what was called insanity gas, and the production of ethyl. So workers were dying, but that was suppressed by an industry that was becoming the nation's largest, and really doesn't want this to take hold. Concerns over ethyl, leaded gas. Supporting the industry was already for many a sine qua non for the continued competitiveness of American business, period. As Alan Loeb maintains, GM's marketing focus on revision and obsolescence connected directly to the normalizing of tetraethyl lead. So now the term "get the lead out" had a whole new meaning. As this hapless dad in the ad is learning. Best ad ever, I think. But yeah, partly too, this is really about GM. The auto industry becomes so important that environmental concerns and health concerns are going to be suppressed, and they are. And there's this famous expression, as GM goes, so the nation goes. And this is a post-war expression, but they are becoming a big, big beast, and an important one. So yeah, credit, Tin Lizzy's cars, motorization, central to the consumer culture of the 20s. Interestingly, so is black music. Okay? So it's a paradox. Just as millions are joining the Klan, millions more are producing really with their wallets an African American music industry, and they're doing that by buying what are then called race records, which are all the rage in the 20s. And now this is all part of the Harlem Renaissance, and the center for this white exposure to the Harlem Renaissance is the Cotton Club. Okay, the first Cotton Club is in New York in 1923, opens there. Another opens in Chicago later. Now, it's owned by an Italian gangster bootlegger, and it's initially a speakeasy because it's Prohibition. Eventually, it's an open it's as depicted there after Prohibition is repealed. But yeah, here you would hear amazing things. You'd hear Duke Ellington, Jelly Roll Morton, James Johnson, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday. Uh, and so emancipating is very, very important in significant ways, and popularizing African and Black music. Its exposure, and when the Cotton Club gets a radio transmitter, that's a nationwide audience on NBC networks. So massive exposure, very positive. But still, the Cotton Club adhered to a strict segregation policy with Black patrons being excluded initially. Interesting stuff. Now the other thing is further to the Harlem Renaissance, which in the 1920s and 1930s, this was known as not that, but it was called the New Negro Movement. Okay, and the New Negro Movement was called that after this publication, this anthology of Black works, and it's poetry, its stories, its essays, and its music. And this is also a time period where there's a few other anthologies. There's one by a guy named James Wendell Johnson, and all of them have one purpose, which is showcasing what Blacks could do. And the interesting thing and the paradox here that I really like is that this is kind of the first step to integration and equality, and it comes from a respect from white Americans. And it's coming not from African American leadership, it's not coming from the top, the Booker T. Washingtons or the Du Boises, right? It's coming from the bottom. Okay? So it's not the talented tenth, and Du Bois had famously said the talented tenth of African Americans would create respect in America and with their scholarly works, right? And it's almost like he's ashamed of the other 90%, but it's not. It ultimately isn't coming from there. It's coming from this. This is where the biggest bridge to white America is really the new Negro music, and that is really opening up a lot of racial pride as well, right? And these anthologies are written by African Americans, and they're saying, you know what, our stuff is not derivative. This is not white culture. It's not African. It's uniquely American. And the interesting thing too is that it becomes radical chic for whites, especially on the left, the lost generation of the 1920s. These artists, the Hemingway crowd, they make it into radical chic. And the best example of that is a guy named Carl von Vechten, who's a friend of Gertrude Stein, who is absolutely the biggest name in radical chic of the time period. Carl von Vechten is a New York hipster, and he tells Gertrude Stein, his good friend, that he's writing this new best-selling this book that he hopes will be a bestseller, and it does. And he says it's going to make Harlem hot. Okay. He says, I have passed practically my whole winter in company with Negroes and have succeeded in getting into the most important sets of them. Right? This will not be a novel about Negroes in the South or white contacts or lynchings. It's going to be about Negroes as they live now in the new city of Harlem. And Stein said she was enormously looking forward to his new book. Super offensive title of that book, but in any case, it gets to that point where Harlem blackness is really hip with some wealthy white patrons in America, and with a much broader audience that appreciates their music over radio. And by buying their records. And it's not just in America, it's also in Europe, especially in France, where there's an obsession about African American music. But yeah, the biggest bridge to white America, that which is most unique, is new Negro music, and two categories, particularly blues and jazz. Blues, super important, comes out of the deep South from the old field hollers, as they were called. These are those old antebellum plantation songs that people described hearing. And blues is a lot closer to those old songs than is jazz, because blues retains the soul of the field songs and the spirituals as it goes mainstream. And the mainstream of blues is usually put at about 1912, because that's when it's first being published by Tin Pan Alley, 1912. Tin Pan Alley is the selling of music sheets to people, which popularizes this type of music. A lot of it sounds like old style country, and in fact, really the only difference between blues and country into the 1920s is race. By the 20s too, we have the rise of the big race record companies, and there are two big nationally known names that come out of that. And one is Ma Rainey, who becomes known as the mother of the blues, and then there's Bessie Smith, who becomes known as the Empress of the Blues. And they both get successful recording careers for big labels like Columbia. Bessie Smith makes thousands of dollars a week in record sales. Okay, so this is really where the mainstreaming of these kind of artists comes from, these race records and radio, Cotton Club, Harlem Renaissance, giving them a national audience. So radio is clearly a big part of making African American music mainstream, and it has the same effect in race as it does with religion in terms of breaking down old prejudices. And that's a fascinating thing, that as radio stations become commercialized, 1920 is the first in Pittsburgh, the licenses tend to be held by, and anyone can get a license simply by applying for one and paying the fee. No real regulation in the early days. And basically every church gets one, right? Every significant church of some import wants one and gets one. As do a lot of appliance stores, and that's because appliance stores want radio stations so they can create a product that then sells more of these, what are then called receiving sets, because they're the ones selling the radio sets. But yeah, it really does a lot to break down prejudices in religion, and most of the popular radio personalities in the 1920s are preachers. Two of the really big ones are into the 20s and 30s are Catholic. Father Coughlin is first, Father Charles Coughlin, very controversial. His career spans from 1926 to 42. And then you get Bishop Sheen with his Catholic Hour on the radio starting in 1930, which is a very simple format. He later makes the leap into television with his Blackboard on a show called Life is Worth Living that is so popular that it unseats Milton Berle. More people are watching it, so he takes Milton Berle's prime spot of evening television in the 1950s. Milton Berle, kind of like a forerunner to Tonight Show comics today, but he's famously quipped, he uses old material too. Any case, so yeah, breaking down prejudices, and think about it this way: if you're, think of the Midwestern farmer who's maybe got he's got this radio in his milk barn. Now here's a Protestant guy who, maybe he's even a Klansman. He's definitely never been inside a Catholic church. He's only heard about Catholics in a negative way, and now he's hearing these radio personalities, and he's agreeing with their politics and their worldview or whatever, right? So yeah, 100%, it has that impact, which is fascinating. Sports too. Radio does a lot for sports, and continues to, or media, television now, really changes sports. Boxing was pretty much dead in the early 1920s when someone at RCA gets the notion to broadcast a Jack Dempsey fight. So that's the first radio broadcast play-by-play, and about 400,000 people tuned in. Massive, right? I mean, the most that could ever get in on a fight was what would fit in the stadium, right? And it was this Jack Dempsey fight was pretty massive. It was actually the biggest crowd that had ever gone to a boxing match, but 400,000. Huge moment for sport. And true commercialization is now possible, and that's the big point. Every one of the major sports becomes a multi-million-dollar industry during the 1920s because of radio. And it also changes sports. Games get shorter. Lacrosse is a good example because they need to fit a broadcast schedule. You have to accommodate. So before the 4 times 15-minute quarter format, it was in lacrosse. It was the first team to win by 3 goals or lead by 5. So evenly matched teams could go all night, or a game could last less than 10 minutes. So that kind of thing cannot happen on radio. Every sport gets modified via broadcasting. First for radio, and again for television. We're still doing that. Now, there's fears back then that the gate would really hurt if you gave it away for free on the radio. And what is quickly found out, everyone finds out, it's actually the opposite, that radio grows your audience enormously. And plus, there's far more money in radio advertising than you'd ever get at the gate. So gate receipts matter less, and that's a theme that continues in sports, big sports franchises to this day. Now, radio is a good segue to another important cultural moment of the 1920s, and that's the Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. So here we have a set-up trial where the business community in Dayton, Tennessee, sees a chance to put their town on the map. So the boosters of Dayton, Tennessee, see this, which is pretty incredible. And they get this teacher, John Scopes, to be the defendant for violating a new anti-evolution law, to say that he violated it, which is called the Butler Act. And the Butler Act banned the teaching of evolution in Tennessee. It's a hotly contested law, and laws like these are being passed in several states in the 1920s. Now, that's also symptomatic of the era, which is the anti-evolution movement. And the anti-evolution movement is partly a function of the emergent fundamentalist movement, which in 1907 saw the establishment of Biola in Los Angeles, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, and the authorship of what is called the Fundamentals. Now, that's a set of books that spells out the non-negotiables of the Christian faith, and that's where the term fundamentalist originates. Now, these books are financed by 2 wealthy Presbyterians, Lyman and Milton Stewart, who were the wealthy founders and owners of Union Oil, right, multimillionaires. So this is very much a story of evangelical Protestants, the fundamentals, drawing a line in the sand to protect the tenets of the faith against modernity, against the secular heresies that had already begun to erode the Christian consensus in the 1890s. There's a real growing secularism that late 19th century already that's partly coming out of Darwinian science, right? And it's one that saw the old, like Harvard and Yale, they started as seminaries, and they still had Christian seminaries, and those become by the 1890s these universalist colleges rather than Christian. So that's a real symbolic loss of control already by the conservatives before the 20th century. But anti-evolutionary sentiment was also, as Matthew Taunton suggests, it was a reaction to the threat of social Darwinism. Okay? That's what is often missed, and this is really what animated William Jennings Bryan, who's known as the Great Commoner, who we've talked about before, because he agrees to step in to help the prosecution. Okay, and he's up against the nation's most famous lawyer, Clarence Darrow. So it really is quite a contest of 2 big names. Clarence Darrow is with the American Civil Liberties Union. Now, Bryan is here because he loathes evolutionary theory, and mainly for its impact on U.S. culture, by which he specifically is reacting to what it means for poor Americans. Okay, but the justification it supplies to the capitalist to be uber ruthless, right? Or to even see ruthlessness, in fact, as a good thing, a survival of the fittest, right? Ruthlessness ensures survival of the fittest. It's good for the human race. Andrew Carnegie had famously decided that Darwin's theories meant he was favoring progression and human good by destroying those who were weaker than him. So the more ruthless he was, the better. It's not just his right, but it's his duty to the race as a stronger individual, right? Also, Darwin's racism and Darwin's entire agenda, which is the preservation of the preferred races, if you read the full title of his book, The Origin of Species, had been disastrous for African Americans, with eugenics being the most visible example that we've already looked at. So this black as beast ideology that pervades America from about 1900 through the 1920s, it really rides tandem with the popularization in America of Darwinian theory. And this idea that you will go backwards down the evolutionary ladder if with miscegenation, right, with intermarriage with blacks. But for H.L. Mencken, another big name in this trial, and one of the most famous and famously despised actually people. He's a writer for the Baltimore Sun, and he really helps popularize this trial. For him, it was first and foremost an opportunity to mock what he called the American bourgeoisie. Great term, right? And it tells you the guy has a wicked sense of humor. The American bourgeoisie, as opposed to bourgeoisie. He has a hate on for backwater America, small town America, sees them all as morons. Mencken also incidentally shared Darwinian views of politics, in that he loathes small minds and by extension, democracy itself. To him, the voter is an idiot, and for Mencken, ultimately fascism becomes preferable. And he famously goes that way by the late 1930s, being in favor of what the Japanese are doing in China, taking over the East by the point of a gun. Anyway, many in the interwar period would fall for fascism, would find themselves on the wrong side of history after World War II. So he's just one example of that. But unlike most who admired the politics of the Japanese and the Germans, he also has a wicked sense of humor. And the trial, which was carried live on radio, really gives him an unparalleled opportunity to show that wit as he's belittling Middle America and its fundamentalist Christianity. And he does that to really great success. And because his view of the trial as a complete and unmitigated disaster for the Christian evangelicals, for Bryan, that's the narrative that dominates for years. And most famously, it was put out in the play Inherit the Wind, okay, which becomes a popular movie as well, popular play and movie. So Mencken's view of the trial is the one that obtained for many decades. Later, more careful analysis by scholars such as Matthew Tautnoz shows us that this apparent victory for that Mencken depicts of science over religion, right, was in fact really a much weightier showdown between a social gospel worldview and a social Darwinian worldview. And less than 20 years later would come a much bigger showdown between, as Winston Churchill put it, quote, the survival of Christian civilization and the lights of perverted science. So foreshadowing what, kind of teaching everyone what is at stake here, telling everyone what was at stake here in eugenics and in this pseudoscience. That's really the learning of World War II, which Churchill was wise to. Anyway, as it was, many in the 20s were really confident that science had made religion unnecessary and that it would soon be extinct in American culture. Which, in any case, is something that someone like H.L. Mencken would have welcomed and did welcome. As we know, things turned out very, very differently. Post-war piety in the Potomac, the mass surge in religious adherence in the late 1940s and 50s, which we'll talk about later. But in any case, there's this wider dimension to this very, very famous and fascinating trial. And I encourage you to think about that. Here's a great quote from William Jennings Bryan, where he lays out that worldview of the how survival of the fittest is just ruinous to our civilization, taking that kind of a worldview. And he says you have to protect. In a garden, you don't let the weeds triumph because they're stronger, right? You protect the roses from the weeds. You do the same to have a healthy society. Very different than the idea that some people are born to be a burden on the rest, eugenics propaganda of the 1920s, or the whole concept that there is something called racial hygiene, right? So this is what underlays this trial, even though, yeah, 100%, there are definitely those ignorant bourgeoisie that Mencken talks about that play a role here too, the fundamentalists, right? So really important trial. Tells us a lot about American culture of the time. Another interwar theme worth looking at, childhood. Now, as you know, we don't get a successful law against child labor until 1938, so child labor is common throughout the interwar period. Now, that starts to change with the Great Depression. In fact, now we get the teenager concept, and that happens because of the Depression. The term teenagers, and so that's actually 1940s, that's Madison Avenue Mad Men, but as a way to market to them. But they invent the term, they coin it. But the teenager concept starts to take shape because during the Depression, jobs are very few, and they must go to men with families, so fathers. So youth become unemployed increasingly, and they start going to high school in record numbers now because of that. Increasingly as well, states pass compulsory education laws for older teens. And in the 1930s, approximately 30% of American teenagers graduated from high school. That'll go up to 50% by 1940, whereas in 1910, it was only 10%. So big shift. So this culture, the transition of youth from worker to student, from asset to liability, that's really important because as they lose their place as secondary earners in the household economy, what happens is that job in the family transitions to mothers, to working mothers. So this is the beginning of the teenager as a concept. It's also the beginning of working mothers as the main secondary earner in the family economy. Another theme really important in the 1920s is gender. And you may have heard during both World Wars, women play a huge role in wartime production and other forms of service. As the soldiers return, they're expected, sometimes forced, to return to the home as men needed these jobs. Social control theory is popular with feminist historians, and it's this idea that the patriarchy is actively working to put women back into the box in the 1920s after their signaled victories up to that point. Now, the problem with this is we can't ascribe motivation to an entire generation. You can look at how institutions behave, but you can't prove a conspiracy per se. And maybe that's being semantics. But in any case, it is true that women had made significant gains, most notably in the 19th Amendment, but also which gave them the vote in 1920, but also court victories over gender discrimination in the workplace. They also had gained access to all the main professional bodies like law and medicine and all the rest. And more women are defying norms by working outside the home. In fact, even in the 1920s, 24% by the end of the decade are working outside the home. But we also know the 20s is a very conservative time. Okay? And that notwithstanding this image of the flapper and the freedom and the independence of the time, right? It's a conservative time and not a time of progress in terms of women's equality. Okay? And that reflects the era's zeitgeist. The women's movement takes a back seat at this time. It's much less active. And what you find is it's a certain class and race of women that are in control of the movement. Feminist scholars will tell you that the 20s is about maternal feminism. This is that older version of feminism where women's unique biology makes them equipped to do certain things, right? Their difference should be respected on that basis, therefore, right? Women's moral influence, their ability to civilize society, right? Now, opposite of what many feminists argue against essentialist traits that have always served as a rationale to exclusion. So maternal feminism is not generally seen in a positive way at all. Either way, the flapper image hides as much as it reveals, and that's the point I'm trying to make here. And in this time period, the real flapper is this dissolute, smoking, sexually permissive young woman, and they were a moral panic. There was a panic about them. They're not celebrated. They are feared. Okay? But what happens is, as with any new cultural style tribe, their look gets commodified. Okay, so the rebel woman's look becomes the trend, and it becomes dumbed down to just a clothing style choice, right? And hairstyle. So by the mid-20s, the flapper is nothing more than a style. Women are expected to be at home, and the marriage bar is still a thing. So yeah, in the interwar, it's okay to work if you're single, but when you marry, you are forced to leave that job, and that is in many occupations. You see it universally in teaching. As soon as you are married, that job must go now to someone else. Okay, so gender is a cultural battlefield in the 1920s, and we often misinterpret it. Okay? At the same time, and very damaging for women, is this growing fascination with the new thing called psychotherapy. Freud is publishing his group Psychology and Analysis of the Ego in 1921. We also get the 1920 is also the Rorschach inkblot test comes out, and all real interesting stuff, none of which can be quantified or tested. And but there's a real sense at the time that there's something called mental hygiene, and that you can treat mental illness. Right? Socialize the antisocial. Mentally ill are also increasingly sterilized, and the USA is the first country to implement compulsory sterilization. Now, the typical sterilized patient is a young single mother, because by definition, single motherhood is seen as being seen as a neurosis, seen as being neurotic. Okay, and that's the thing about psychology, is it's one of the few places where most postmodern theorists really excel, because it is a place where discourse has power, right? The inherent power of language, right? Labeling language. And most of the labels like hysteria and neurosis are affixed to women, right? Also becomes very easy in the 1920s to incarcerate a woman, to have them committed against their will, simply with a doctor's order, or a police can do that. Okay? And what we get is the rise of this new institution, a midway place between a hospital and an insane asylum, called a psychopathic hospital. Many of these are being built in the 1920s and 30s, and the idea is it's a more enlightened way to treat people. So instead of warehousing people in assignments, these are temporary treatment centers. Best case, you'll be treated, go home. If not, then it's off to the asylum. If you're rehabilitated, you go home under the surveillance of social workers. Now, the interesting thing is most of the targets of these, most of the patients in these places that are often misdiagnosed and end up being warehoused are women, as are most of those working in this service, right? So it's also a time of the professionalization of social agencies, and the typical sterilized person, the typical victim of this kind of a treatment at the time, and misdiagnoses, and a massive over-incarceration and committal of people. In fact, by 1949, half of all hospital beds in the U.S. are mental patients, okay? Half of all. And in the 1920s, 1 in 370 people in the U.S. are declared to be insane, mostly women, okay? So as I'm saying, just as mostly women are the victims of this, there are also most of those who are in the industry, okay, because feminists are advancing by being part of this system, okay. But yeah, this misplaced confidence in pseudoscience at the time, plus patriarchal ideas of how women should act, plus all shrinks tend to be men, and you have this phenomena, this interesting phenomena, the psychopathic hospital, right? It's a really fascinating aspect of the 1920s. If you watch the movie A Changeling with Angelina Jolie, nobody's seen it, I used it in a film course, but Clint Eastwood makes this movie, and it's a true story of a woman named Christine Collins, who is incarcerated involuntarily against her will. With that too, you also see the rise of the importance of European psychosomatic therapies, and she gets treated to electroconvulsive therapy. This is another really interesting aspect of gender in the 1920s. Okay? Now, while the public fights over suffrage and equal rights kind of took a backseat in the 1920s, the women's movement, as simple as this, is the fact that the women's movement tries and fails to pass a constitutional amendment guaranteeing gender equality. They call this the Equal Rights Amendment, and it's seen as necessary because the 14th Amendment, which we talked about before, did not apply to women. That's the Equal Protection of Laws Amendment that gave freedmen civil rights, if you recall. But Section 2 of the 14th specifically says male inhabitants. So it is meant to be tailored for men only, clearly, and that was also deliberate, because America was not ready for the female vote, for the women's vote. or other equal rights for women. Now, feminists wanted this loophole closed in an explicit constitutional guarantee even after they won the right to vote. And in fact, they're still waiting for that. The ERA movement is now over a century old. 38 states have ratified it, though, which is the 3/4 minimum that is needed, but it is yet to be certified by Congress. There's a variety of reasons for that. Partly that's because women themselves have been divided over on it, on whether it would be beneficial. Some, interestingly, opposed it over the years because they feared it would subject women to military service, to the draft. Also, perhaps more importantly, its provisions have been passed in other ways, most notably the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned workplace discrimination and included gender in that. But yeah, its failure to launch at this point is sort of a symbol of the stalled women's movement in this time. That said, at the same time, women have a lot of agency, and they're quietly asserting that in the background. And one way you see that is family planning. Now, in the interwar, along with more Americans in cities for the first time, more Americans are living in cities over rural areas for the first time in 1920-21. We see, along with that, a continuing decline in the birth rate. And this is a long-standing thing. In the year 1800, as you see in this graph here, most women in the U.S. had 7 children. That number has steadily decreased over the years, and in the interwar decades that continues, and it drops quite precipitously from about 3.6 down to 2.2. To the point that in the 1920s, it's that obvious that the term nuclear family is now coined. And with the Merriam-Webster dictionary citing its first usage in 1924. So the nuclear family is a phenomenon of the 1920s. And this speaks to a quiet female agency, as I said, notwithstanding the rampant and the nonlinear gender discrimination. This fact that women are taking control of their family size clearly means that they are taking to birth control, even though contraception is not legalized by American courts until 1965. And there's always a disconnect between law and its practice and its enforcement. And that's an important thing to remember in history. Women are also working more, and like everyone else in the 1920s, they are also investing more. And we get this culture phenomenon known as the ladies of the ticker, and that is the title of a book about this by historian George Robb, but he bases it on the title of a 1929 article of the same name that was published by Eunice Barnard just 6 months before the October 24 stock market crash in 1929. And here she describes this really rapid growth of the female stock speculator and how women of all ages, regions, any socioeconomic background, they're making windfalls off of their investments, and they're quite savvy. And their numbers are growing massively at the point that she writes this article. And in fact, in some large corporations, women own the majority of the stocks. And these are stenographers, they're heiresses, they're waitresses, they're businesswomen, and they're housewives. The article from 1929 profiles some really great stories. One is a woman farmer in the Midwest calling her female broker in New York to buy shares of an automobile stock. She pays $6 for the call and for the purchase, and makes nearly $2,000 on that investment overnight. So Bernard writes that that history would show that this is a time when, quote, women for the first time in this country on a large scale financially became people, end quote. Tragic that it's 6 months before the stock market crash, but here's the interesting thing here. Women didn't have the freedom that men did, or as much money, but they had more interest and they had more confidence. And it's the wife, not the husband, who knew the stock names. They're the ones reading the stock tips in the tabloid newspaper. They're the ones that are hearing the market reviews and the Wall Street closing prices on the radio every day from home, usually. And women tended to ask more questions of the broker, and also it is women who counseled husbands on which department store stock to buy, or whatever kind of stock to buy, because they know the businesses. And this made sense because as advertising companies were the first to learn, women often held the role of family investment manager. They made the buying decisions in North American families. And in fact, it's estimated that 85% of the spending in America was in women's hands. That's on food, clothes, education, travel, cars, as well as stocks. Advertisers were quick to pick this up, as we've talked about before, and tailored their ads towards women because they knew they were the ones doing the research and making the family buying decisions. And unfortunately, as we know, this doesn't end well. The crash. Okay, so why the big crash in 1929? Historians debate that. There's a few things. Mainly, it is over-speculation in the stock market. It's also the fact of rising interest rates, and then there's also these underlying economic weaknesses that historians debate how much any one of them factored into this. Now, what matters is, and what is obvious, is that all these factors together creates a bubble that eventually burst, and that led to a massive sell-off and a significant decline in stock prices in 1929. And that is what is known as Black Thursday, where that week where stocks fell by 25% in late October. But they're only getting started. By the end of the year, the stock market was worth half of its value, and it finally bottoms out in 1932. 2 years later, at that point, it has dropped 89%. Massive amount of wealth wiped off the books. Now, the response initially is completely inadequate, and that's because Republican Herbert Hoover is president, and consistent with Republican ideology, does not see it as the state's role to intervene in a big way. But he does come around to the idea that he should protect American industry, and is sold on the idea of a tariff, and he famously signs the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And this was to protect American industry from foreign imports, to give them a leg up. Now what happens, of course, is all other nations follow suit and set up their own tariff walls, their own tariff barriers against American exports. So U.S. exports then tank, okay? And this shutters more American industry and famously worsens the Depression. So, and this is the big lesson of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and it applies still to today, that protectionism is really a beggar thy neighbor reaction that will rebound against you. At a more fundamental level than that, even, trade really is the basis of global wealth. Okay, and that goes back to when the first caveman came out and traded something with his neighbor. Trade is the basis of global wealth, and tariffs stymie trade, simple as that. Now, at its worst, as I said, it's only getting started. At its nadir point, 25% of Americans were unemployed, 50% of African Americans. Now, this time period is often captured here in this clearly ironic statement there in the top left, this photograph by Margaret Burke White, who publishes this was published in 1937 Life magazine. It's a statement on race and the American dream. Now, it's one of the few era-defining depictions of the Great Depression, and in fact, as you may have heard, it depicts a lineup it's not a soup lineup of the unemployed, but of survivors of an Ohio River flood in Louisville, Kentucky. Okay, but the statement is accurate behind it. The Depression really affected those already at the bottom the most. Those without work went hungry, while those with work, interestingly, were likely to see their standard of living increase as prices plummeted. Nevertheless, that more fortunate majority would also see their real wealth decline, and they would suffer many years of employment insecurity, while invariably they're supporting extended family that haven't done as well. It also affects their mobility. So everyone is impacted. Now, the stock market crash in 1929 was indeed the start, and most people think this is really where the curtain comes down, but it really wasn't. It's a crash that is made worse by the bank collapses that came later, and that's what really entrenched the downturn. Okay? Over 9,000 American banks failed between 1930 and 1933. And this widespread collapse of the banking system was a really major contributor to the severity and the length of the Great Depression. Now, in contrast, if you look north of the border, not a single bank failed in Canada during the Great Depression. And so why is that? Well, the answer is quite simple. It was American regulatory structures or lack thereof. That is the main reason. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was not yet established, so depositors had no guarantee of their savings. And like many regulations, the FDIC exists because of what happened in the 1930s. 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signs the Glass-Steagall Act. Super important. The Emergency Banking Act, creating it, excuse me, the Emergency Banking Act of 1933 created the Glass-Steagall Act, and it's about restoring faith in the banking sector. And it's in some ways it's still a thing. Okay, runs now are insured against. Okay, that was preceded by the new president declaring a 4-day bank holiday. Okay, nationwide. So in the context of all these banks folding, and these famous runs on the bank, right? All these banks being shuttered. The FDR declares that all banks will be closed for a 4-day period, and the feds used that break time to inspect the bottom line of each bank, to close the ones that were underwater, and then to prop up the ones that could be saved. Okay? Also, quickly apparent why all this happened, because it turns out the banks had made risky loans, particularly to finance stock market speculation. And there is no separation at that time between commercial banking and investment banking. So it's a vicious circle where the banks are making loans to finance stock market speculation, and they're taking their own depositors' money and investing in stocks, right? And now the result of that is the most important part of the Glass-Steagall Act, and that's what you want to know, is that primarily it's about separating commercial banking from investment banking, really to prevent the risky use of depositors' funds. So remove the temptation from bankers to gamble with investors' money to prevent this conflict of interest. So now banks could no longer sell securities. Securities are stocks, bonds, investment contracts, whatever, right? So this separation simply aimed to protect consumers and stabilize the financial system, and it worked very well for many decades. Then you're thinking, okay, well, what happened in 2007, 2008? I remember the big banking crisis, right? Lehman Brothers collapsing, Merrill Lynch, Bear Stearns, 81 more pages if you're on Wikipedia. Okay, well, it's very simple. What happens is that neoconservatives forget the lesson of the Great Depression, and they were always chomping at the bit for deregulation, for getting government out of banking and freeing the banks of the rules on mortgages and loans and investments that came out in the 1930s. Now, this really starts under Ronald Reagan, and then finally in 1999, the central provision of the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed in another act. It superseded. And it removed this enforced separation of commercial investment banking. Now, supporters of repeal were arguing that it would promote financial innovation, competition, and efficiency. Now, those arguing against repeal had a longer memory, and they argued it would lead to excessive risk-taking and potentially another financial crisis. Well, guess who was right? If you've seen the movie The Big Short, you know the answer. So it turns out this is one of those beautiful areas where history does supply some really good, clear lessons sometimes, very clear ones. And the lesson of 1930 is banks should not be innovative. They should be conservative. And they need a choke chain so when Wall Street executives get itchy, get bored, they want to start making money off of new complicated investment products, that they get snapped back to reality. It's really as simple as that. In any case, a Great Depression, brutal on the Americans. Middle class is just winnowed out. And we start getting what are called Hoovervilles, where we have homeless Americans with very little to support them, living in shacks, tar paper shacks outside of cities. Sometimes with their Tin Lizzie, their old cars there, and you get some amazing, massive Hoovervilles growing all over America. The largest here, located in St. Louis, had as many as 8,000 people from 1930 to 1936. Okay, so this is the 1920s. And I warned you, it was a lot. And next, we're going to look briefly at how FDR's New Deal aimed to help Americans, how important the New Deal was, how amazing it was actually, and in terms of really turning almost basically fundamentally, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but going into the next lecture, but basically putting the brakes on capitalism in order to save capitalism from itself. So America takes a socialist turn in the New Deal as it never had and never had before and never has since a New Deal under Roosevelt in order to save capitalism. Okay? Under the threat now of the growing popularity of communism among the American working class. Okay? So we'll look at that, and we'll also look at how the Depression really only finally ends as America enters World War II and becomes the famous, quote, arsenal of democracy. Okay, thanks for listening. If you enjoy this, subscribe to my channel. Kidding. If you have questions, let me know. All right, cheers.